But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
That video you just watched is a segment from Michael Parenti's speech, The U.S. Imperialism in the USSR. In this video, he talks about how countries in the global north take a large percentage of their wealth and resources from the global south. There is no such thing as a poor country, just overexploited countries. Good afternoon, I'm Lorenzo DeFalco, and today I'll be discussing the effects of unequal exchange on the global south's population with the past 15 years. So let's define some terms. The global south, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a group of nations that experience relatively low levels of urbanization and industrialization compared to countries in the global north, which are countries north of it. As you can see here, according to this this image provided by the United Nations Trade Commission, you can see that the countries highlighted in red are considered global south countries, and the countries up north that are blue are considered global north countries. The general consensus in the pattern you can see here is that most countries in the global south were former colonies of countries in the global north and have some of the poorest economies in the world. The general consensus is that after colonial times and these colonies started having their troops withdrawn and back to the global north, we started living in a more meritocratic society. If your country has strong institutions, strong government, and your people work hard, your country will become rich. Likewise, if your country fails to follow all of those, you will become poor. The answer is a lot more complex than that, though. And that's where the theory of unequal exchange comes in, which is the practice of one country relying on a mass appropriation of resources from another country, essentially extracting resources from one country for a cheap cost and selling those resources back for a higher cost. This brings us to the theory of unequal exchange. This image provided from Hakim accurately shows the hidden transfer value. The North purchases Southern materials for cheap and sets product prices. Meanwhile, the South has to buy back the products that they harvested themselves for a much more expensive price. This brings us back to our thesis of the extent to which unequal exchange has affected the populations of the global South within the past 15 years, which is through economic inequality, environmental destruction, and political corruption. Let's start with economic inequality. This graph provided by the Environmental Change, which is from researchers Amin and Kolo, shows a graph that represents the drain from the South by resource. Essentially, how valuable are the resources from the South that the North uses? As you can see here in 2015 alone, in terms of energy, the North accumulated over almost $5 trillion worth of materials. For lands, it was almost $6 trillion. For labor, it was almost $20 trillion, and for materials, for energy, it was almost $4 trillion. And this graph shows the average drain since 1990. And as you can see, even though we did see a decline from its peak in 2006, the general trend has been going up and has now returned back to pre-1990 levels. How does this tie into economic inequality? Well, as you can see, this image is this image provided from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Interviews it showcases Zambian workers that were on strike. They work for the KCM mine, which is a mine owned by British conglomerate Vendetta Resources, which is a copper company. These people were on strike and they were interviewed about why they went on strike. One of the workers said, "The wages that we receive are well below the cost of basic food basket. If you look at our salaries, we are earning no more than $172 per month, so we are actually earning less than the national minimum wage." This story is more than just unequal exchange, though. This happens very common with indigenous people and people naturally living in their countries, such as in America. According to this story, The Social Justice by AP Stimuli, It says, over 6,000 of oil taken from my lands, he said, and I get 89 bucks. Oh yeah, they'll even tell you that they overpaid me, and the next check they take it out. Like so many beneficiaries of the Indian Trust, Kennerly would go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs office looking for answers to his questions, answers that never came. Kennerly died without ever seeing justice. On the Navajo reservation, like Mary Jane Johnson, an 87-year-old woman with 5 oil wells pumping on her land. She speaks only Navajo, so her story is translated to me through her son and daughter. The oil company started drilling on Johnson's land in the 1950s. You might imagine her living in a mansion after all these years, but she's still too poor to afford running water. Johnson could see the oil was pumping and hear the sound of the oil rushing through the pipes of her land, but she wasn't getting the funds she so desperately needed. Next, we have environmental destruction. This photo here, this photo taken by Dennis Onyagi, showcases the aftermath of Mozambique, a tropical storm Idai. This is considered the 3rd deadliest tropical cyclone to hit the southern hemisphere in recorded history. This country, due to its poor infrastructure, thanks to unequal exchange, they don't have the money to fix these natural resources, to fix their lands and fix the aftermath. Due to their geographic locations, countries in the global south generally face much more harsher changes from climate change and natural disasters than countries in the global north. Another example is in India. This photo, taken by Samir Mushtaq, shows dried up integration due to natural disasters and such as frost storms and whatnot that the country has historically not experienced until recent times, has hurt their agricultural efforts. Next, we have political corruption. This painting, painted by Diego Rivera, showcases the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat commenced by the CIA in 1954. In 1954, Guatemala democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz to be their leader. He had many plans, including being lax on anti-exploitation laws for bananas. There was a huge exploitation problem, and he wanted to be more strict about it and make sure that the people working and harvesting these bananas were not exploited. Unfortunately, the U.S. was not happy with this, including the United Fruit Company, so they teamed up with the CIA to launch a full coup to oust the leader, and instead get President Carlos Castillo Armas to lead the country. A much more recent example is in 2009. This photo taken by Zoe Alexandra, shows an indigenous woman of Bolivia protesting against the police because the first indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, wanted to be more lax on lithium and exploitation laws there, and the United States was not happy with this. Lithium is a very profitable resource, and we use it for our iPhones and our electric vehicles, etc. So some solutions. Some solutions we have is boycott all products made by people or corporations, allow nations in the global south to democratically elect their own leaders, or continue to maintain control over the governments. Our most effective solution was option B, because it allows people in the global south to have more democratic freedom over their lands and fully fix the political corruption. And then my citations. Thank you.
2 questions for you. First up, how valid and reliable were the sources that you used, and how do you know they were?
I know they're very reliable because every single source that I used was peer-reviewed and made by scholars and very reliable organizations such as the United Nations and Harvard EDU, Harvard University specifically, so I know they're historically been very reliable sources.
And second question, if you had more time, what additional research would you have conducted related to this issue?
More research I would have done and I chose not to include was specifically the 1954 coup in Iran. I wanted to include that originally because it talked about how Iran wanted to nationalize their oil and how the US wanted to overthrow their government to get access to that oil, but I ultimately decided not to do it and went with the Guatemalan coup instead because we're still seeing some of the ramifications of that to this day, and I thought it would be more relevant.